Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and before we get started on tonight's story, I wanted to tell you about a book that's currently available from tonight's author. J Group has a new book that's currently available on Amazon, and it is called No Sleep Tonight. Scary short stories. If you like any of the other stories by Jordan Group, or if you like the one tonight, I suggest checking out the link in the description and buying some of his wares. And now, on to tonight's story. I was riding the elevator up to the 4th floor when I noticed it for the first time. When I noticed them for the first time. Someone else was on the elevator with me. Someone I didn't recognize. She was new and looked barely old enough to have graduated high school, and yet her ID badge proclaimed in bold print, Allison Ivers, registered nurse, 8 East Medicine. I have been seeing a lot of new people around the hospital recently, I realized. It was rare to see a single familiar face these days, when I used to run into people I knew all the time. Maybe I was just getting old. I mean, people were retiring. These new fresh-faced youngsters were coming in and taking their place. Sure, that was probably it. The young woman was dressed in immaculate white scrubs, neatly pressed and matching top and bottoms. Her ID badge clipped to her pocket, but there was something unusual about her. It took me a few moments to figure out what it was, and finally, I realized she was devoid of all possessions, carrying no phone or lunch bag in her hand, no purse or water bottle. It was just her, riding the elevator up to the 8th floor for what I presumed would be a grueling 12-hour shift. My point is, it was odd for her to be empty-handed, since usually people at least brought a backpack or a purse to work with them. Most people were also carrying coffee cups this time of day, like I was. But she had nothing. Then I saw something else that was strange. The woman's hair had been blown askew in the wind outside, revealing a thin, notched groove on the back of her neck, like something that you'd see in an air conditioner on a car, concealing a control panel. At least that's what it reminded me of. She noticed me looking and self-consciously covered her neck with her hand, preventing me from examining it any further. I mean, I was so overcome with curiosity that I almost asked her about it, despite her discomfort. But then the elevator dinged and the door opened to the 4th floor. People were waiting to get on, and I had to hurry up and get to my shift. So I left the elevator reluctantly, feeling confused, to say the least. I couldn't help but think about that in the following weeks as I noticed more and more young-looking nurses and doctors, cleaners and food service staff. Not only young, but beautiful as well. The older staff members began to disappear one by one. I was always told it was an early retirement or a family emergency, bereavement leave, or that people simply left to work at other jobs. And yet there was no going away parties, no retirement celebrations. One thing was consistent. The young, beautiful people in white scrubs always came in to take their jobs. The new people started taking over management positions next, becoming charge nurses, clinical managers, and head doctors, as more and more fresh faces showed up week after week. I started to notice the difference. Their skin had a slightly waxy sheen to it, sometimes a little plastic-looking in the right sort of light. They were all, without exception, punctual and methodical, brutally efficient, and quick to point out the errors of less perfect coworkers. It started getting harder and harder to keep up. I started getting warnings from the new nursing manager, saying my performance was lagging far behind that of my coworkers, that I was too slow and I couldn't keep up with the increasingly advanced computer systems they were bringing in to monitor the patients and document status changes. And then, one night during a graveyard shift, I began to realize what was happening. I had suspected it, sure, but who really believes such delusional, paranoid fantasies? The funny thing was, the revelation, the unveiling, all of it, was a complete accident. A little bit of serendipity, I'd say. I was reading a technology article on the computer during my break at the desk. As usual, it was too busy to leave the floor, and the hospital had had made substantial cutbacks so that we never seemed to have time for proper breaks anymore. Each nurse's patient workload had doubled, and if we left our post, it would mean some confused patient falling and breaking their hip due to a bad alarm not being answered in time. So we just stayed put in fear of losing our nursing licenses. At least I did. The only other nurse I knew who remained on the unit was Melanie. She and I had been working there together for 10 years and had stuck it out through all the recent changes. We were surrounded by fresh-faced young nurses and neatly pressed white scrubs, all new to the hospital within the past few months, as far as I can remember. Still, I was starting to get used to it, starting to adapt to the changes. So much so that I forgot about them all around us, as the news articles mesmerized me more and more as I started to read aloud. "Hey, get this, Mel," I said, getting her attention and speaking loudly. "Within the next 10 years, robots will have taken over about 20 million jobs by 2030, and the US alone already lost 60 million jobs." We had just been discussing this exact phenomenon more and more recently, just a few hours before, in fact. Melanie's uncle had lost his job to an automation, and others in her family were finding it next to impossible to find jobs in their chosen fields these days. And all the tasks that had once been well-paying jobs for people were now simply, "Good thing robots could overtake our jobs, right?" I heard a brief whirring sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and looked up to see a half-dozen faces of white-clad co-workers all sharply staring at me. Every staff member sitting at the nursing stations was glaring at me. I wouldn't be so sure. Over in Japan, they've got nurse robots in the long-term care homes. They deliver pills, check vital signs, hell, they give the patients a damn cuddle and sing them songs even. Can you imagine? I mean, they couldn't replace us entirely, not yet. But if you get a fleet of those things in a hospital, you only need a few real nurses. As Melanie spoke, the nurses and doctors in their white scrubs slowly stood, all at the same time in unison. Their movements were smooth and organized, each one a perfect replication of humanity. My voice was caught in my throat as I tried to speak, to warn Melanie of the white-clad androids who were closing in on us from all sides. I had never felt so terrified. My voice was caught in my throat as I tried to speak, to warn Melanie of the white-clad androids who were closing in on us from all sides. I'd never felt so terrified, my vocal cords suddenly incapable of producing speech. Only a hoarse whisper came out, my trembling hand reaching up to touch Mel's shoulder to pull her away from the computer so that she could see for herself. She was focused on her documentation and didn't see them. "What? Stop! What's your deal? Why are you pinching me?" She was shouting as I squeezed her shoulder involuntarily harder than I meant to. But it was too late. They were all around us. They could tell that I knew more than I was supposed to. She finally turned around just in time to see a half-dozen vaguely plastic-skinned people standing in a circle around us. They were youthful, fresh-faced, and dressed in immaculate white scrubs without a stain on them, smiling without happiness. "You should not be reading that news article at work," said one nurse in a monotone voice. "It is not appropriate. Please observe the rules and guidelines set forth by management at all times. Thank you." I was going to play it cool, but I looked at Melanie and saw it was far too late for that now. She was terrified, stuttering, pointing with a trembling hand at the robotic humanoid surrounding us. None of you are... What the hell is happening here?" The androids who had been replacing our coworkers did not appreciate being noticed. Whoever had created them and installed them did not want them to be seen. Their eyes began to glow red and their smiling faces turned to sharp-toothed sneers. Terrified, I tried to stand up to defend myself, but immediately found myself on the ground, my head bleeding and aching after a sharp blow to the temple from one of them. I hadn't even seen it coming. Melanie was on the ground next to me, appearing half-conscious from a similar injury. The androids stood around us, looking down unsympathetically, raising their boots to crush our skulls beneath their feet. When they froze, the overhead PA crackled to life and I heard the bored voice of the switchboard operator. "Attention, please. Code gray, Wi-Fi down. Code gray, Wi-Fi down. Code gray, Wi-Fi down." She had said literally the only words that could have saved our lives. The hospital Wi-Fi had gone down temporarily, and apparently this had caused the robots to malfunction. I got up breathlessly panting and pulling Melanie to her feet next to me. We didn't have time to consider what had just happened and how we had almost been killed by our imposter coworkers. Before we could say a word to each other, a monitor began to alarm, indicating a patient had taken the turn for the worse. 8-2 is in VTAC, I yelled, disbelief in my voice. And who would have thought this night could get any worse? After rushing to the room and calling a code blue, we performed CPR on the pulseless patient. A dozen other familiar staff members came to the floor and helped us save them, referring the person to the ICU after reviving them. "How short-staffed are you on the 4th floor these days?" asked one nurse in the aftermath. "I know there's been cutbacks lately, but this is ridiculous. It's just been you two, the whole floor? This patient's lucky to be alive." I didn't understand at first. Then I realized. All the new nurses in white scrubs were gone. Whisked away to a repair lab somewhere, I guess. "They're gonna need to hire more people again," I said. Melanie sighed dejectedly. There would be plenty of hard days ahead of us until we were fully staffed again. "Actually, you wouldn't believe what I just read about the things they're doing in Japan. Robot nurses. It's wild stuff," said a critical care nurse at the bedside. She had been able to get an IV when none of the rest of us could have. She flipped her hair back, and as she did, a simple, notched groove on her neck, barely noticeable. But there. The woman caught me looking and dropped a sly wink, but nobody saw but me. "Some of the better ones even run on 5G. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and before we get started on tonight's story, I want to let you know about a book that's currently available on Amazon. It's called Unclean Spirits, Horrifying Stories by Berkram Man, and you guys might know Berkram Man as, well, from No Sleep, as the author of tonight's story, Mandark. Unclean Spirits is a huge collection of stories, and a part of the Never Sleep Again Best Creepy Tales book series. It's available now on Amazon, in Kindle, paperback, and hardcover. And now, on to tonight's story. They call him Man-Pig because of the ghastly snout-like cleft in his chin, and a chronic lung disease that left him with a raspy voice, which tumbled out of his mouth as grunts and squeals. You know, like a pig. Naturally, it wasn't exactly a term of endearment. See, Man-Pig and I were together in school, and so I was a personal witness to the hell that he was put through by other kids. It wasn't strange to see flocks of mean teenagers buzzing around him, stripping away at his dignity like woodpeckers with their nasty barbs. And that was when he wasn't busy getting his already unappealing face rearranged by others, all simply for being who he was. Could you imagine what that's like? To have violence heaped on you for simply existing. To be used as a stepping stone for someone looking to climb the social ladder. Things weren't better at home for him either. A mother who was addicted to meth, and an abusive alcoholic father made up his family. And I'm using that term very loosely here. It wasn't a surprise to any of us that knew him, that he couldn't make much of his life at all. In fact, it was damn near a miracle that he survived decades of abuse and turned into the kind-hearted man people eventually came to know him as. Years after the rest of us had graduated, gone to college, and or moved on with our lives, Man-Pig chose to go back to our high school to work as a janitor. He chose to shuffle through and clean the same hallways that had so tormented him. Maybe he was trying to exorcise old demons. I don't know. What I do know is that he happened to be there when my son was going through the most difficult period in his life. Believe me, I tried everything I could to bring the torment to an end. I approached the school authorities, his teacher, the school counselor, the principal. But to no avail. They fed me platitudes, assured me it'll stop, but it never did. I spoke to the parents of the 4 boys who were the worst of them all, pleaded cajoled, threatened to call the police, but it only ended up making things worse. My son started hiding his cuts and bruises. My efforts to help him had resulted in him pulling away from me. Man-Pig was a godsend at a time like this. He lended an ear to my son when he needed a confidant the most. Perhaps it was due to the fact that Man-Pig had been through the same shit he was going through. My son found it easy to open up to him. But to this day, I think those conversations were a major part of my son not taking a disastrous step. They bonded well. My son came to look at Man-Pig as an uncle-like figure, one who in turn completely broke down when my son's torment was escalated one last time. I was in office when I got the call that day. I remember how the coffee mug dropped from my hands and crashed to the floor, some of its shattered pieces bouncing off the tiles and landing on my shoe. I remember being in a daze as I walked out of the building, got in my car and drove to the beginning of the bike trail in the woods behind the school, now cordoned off by yellow tape. I remember shoving aside uniformed police officers and retching when I finally saw him. How broken and bloodied he looked. How his skull had caved in at a point. I still have nightmares about my son's body lying in the dirt track out in the woods. We all knew who did it. But knowing something isn't the same as proving it in court. And besides, those four were kids, juveniles. Even if they were to get convicted, the justice system would just spit them back out on the streets in a couple of years. No. Justice needed to be served here, and it wasn't coming from the varnished furnishings of a courtroom. Things needed a medieval touch. Once again, it was Man-Pig who swooped down like an angel and saved me from doing something irreversible. If it hadn't been for him, I would have rotted in some dank prison cell right now. He showed up at my house 2 days after my son was killed, crying and blubbering in his usual grunts and squeals. "I'm so sorry," he wheezed, his chest getting racked with sobs and hiccups. "Couldn't help him." He whistled, a breath out of blocked nasals. "Should have been there. Should have stopped them." I wiped tears off my eyes and let him in. We talked about my son over a bottle of liquor and through the haze of cigarette smoke, quickly hatching a plan for revenge. No. For justice. We hunted them down one by one under the cover of darkness. Through the shadows we moved like death incarnate, stalking our prey. Once again, I could not have done this alone. Creating alibis, picking the right tools, cutting through chain-link fences, getting rid of blood-soaked clothes. Man-Pig guided me through it all, even when I was quaking in fear in my car, vomit stuck in my throat. Wondering whether I had it in me to do it or not. He was there right beside me, patting my back, whispering that I could do it. For my boy, lost to the abyss far before his time. By the fourth one, I was pretty used to it all. The sound of the golf club hitting the back of the kids' heads. And how my muscles stretched with each swing, and the mist of blood and brain matter swirled in the air, the eyes rolling back up into the skull, the way their knees buckled as they collapsed onto the ground. I felt nothing. Fear, sadness, elation. Nothing. Just glad that it was done. Over. Little did I know that a lifetime of nightmares was just about to start. "He walked into the precinct and just confessed," the reporter's voice blared through the TV. "The infamous local serial killer responsible for the murder of many kids." I felt a lump in my throat. Man-Pig's grainy face was plastered on the screen. A hideous, monstrous thing. Breath escaping my lungs. He'd done it. He'd taken the fall, one last gift for the father of the boy he cared for. He knew the cops won't stop hunting. He knew that we weren't perfect criminals, and sooner or later we'd be caught. So he took it upon himself to stop that bleak future by sacrificing himself. Pictures of the victims started flashing on the TV. 5 of them, including my son. My head swooned and I almost blacked out. I grabbed my car keys off the counter and I ran out the door, each stride sending a knife through my heart, slipping into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys with sweat soaking my clothes. I tried to make sense of what I'd just seen. But surely there was a mistake. Surely they'd gotten it wrong, or they were trying to pin my son's murder on him as well, to tie up loose ends with a pretty little bow. They let me meet him. A cramped, cold, dimly lit cell. He stood up when he saw me. Walking towards the thick bars, wrapped his bony hands around them. A noise erupted from his throat, a grotesque mixture of grunts and squeals, exactly like the one he'd made when he first saw me after my son's death. And that's when I understood what that sound actually meant. That when he met me that day, he wasn't crying. No. He was laughing at me. When Julia Adler unearths the corpse of a famous actress from the 30s in her family's theater, what was previously thought of as a disappearance is revealed to be a murder. With the board of directors trying to push her out and the theater's reputation on the line, she looks to you to discover the truth about this cold case investigation. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I'm super excited to tell you about today's sponsor. A sponsor that put together this lovely little tale of murder and cold case corpses. So whether it's a date night or a game night, Hunt a Killer brings people together by challenging them to decode ciphers, examine clues, and solve puzzles. It's like an escape room, only delivered right to your door. Hunt a Killer isn't even just about solving a murder. This game tells an immersive story that you'll learn about the backstories of each of the suspects, their complicated relationships to the victim, and watch everything unfold as you complete each episode, or each box. One of my favorite parts about Hunt a Killer is that you can join their spoiler-free community with thousands of members to help each other solve difficult puzzles and talk about true crime. And part of the proceeds of every box goes to the Cold Case Foundation, an organization that is dedicated to helping with real-life cold cases. John E. Douglas, the inspiration for the Netflix show Mindhunter, is the chairman of the board. Personally, I've been really wanting to work with Hunt a Killer because it seems right up everybody's alley, plus it seems like something fun that I can actually bring to you guys that I know is really quality, and it's something that many of us can be able to do online together via Discord or whatever you happen to use to talk with your friends. Right now, you can go to huntakiller.com/MrCreepyPasta and use code CreepyPasta for 25% off your first box. Again, make sure you use code CreepyPasta for a 20% off discount. And find out if you have what it takes to hunt a killer. The hook fell on a Wednesday. And it took Davis Nielsen. Davis is an Army veteran. He has a wife and kids, but spends the majority of his days down at the Rotary Club playing poker with his buddies and drinking stale beer. He drives an old flatbed with rust-colored peeling paint, and he lives somewhere between the cornfield and the farm stand. The way Nielsen's friends tell it, Davis wasn't having a good night. Got poor hand after poor hand, bad bluff after bad bluff, and by the end of the night, he owed just about everyone quite a bit of cash. Davis's best friend, Charlie Danes, walked back to his truck with him. He claimed Davis was pretty mad about the way the card game shook out. Charlie wanted to discreetly offer to pay part of the tab. "You're talking, you know," Charlie told me, as he sat across my desk at the Habitsville Gazette office. I was trying to push a couple bills into his hand. Davis wouldn't have it. And he said so, too. He said, "I'm a grown man, blah, 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 and I can pay for myself." And all that stuff. And They kept bringing up how he thought Bill Weathers was cheating. So, he was pissed. "I thank you for the details, Mr. Danes," I said with a polite smile. "But let's try to keep the story moving." Charlie cleared his throat. Right, okay, he said. And then he paused, like he didn't want to get to the next part. And honestly, after hearing what he had to say, I don't blame him. He was mid-sentence when the damn thing came down. Charlie shook his head, one hand nervously petting his scraggly beard. I don't want to make any sort of sound. I don't think Davis even knew it was coming. It was dark out, so I couldn't really make out what it was until he cleared his throat. Until it went through his back. The tip came out the front of his chest. I stopped what I was writing in my notebook. I even put down my pen. "I'm sorry," I said. What exactly came out of his chest?" "It was a hook," Charlie said. "About this big," he added, holding his hands apart, "about the length of a loaf of bread. It was on a big wire or something coming down from the sky. It got Davis on the line, just sort of stopped talking, and the blood started gurgling out of his mouth like a baby spitting up, and then Charlie stopped himself, his mustache quivering with the shallow breaths he was taking. I'm sorry," he said, laying his hand on his chest. "I've been having chest pain since it happened. The doctor says it was stress." "Well, don't worry about it," I said. "But, what happened next?" "Well, it went real quiet for a minute. It was dark, and there was just this one street light outside the rotary. Dave's shirt was gray. No, green. A real dark forest green, so the blood spread slow, and the end of the hook didn't stand out so good. We all sort of looked at it, more surprised than anything." Charlie shifted in his seat. I could see his hands clasping and unclasping, the thin sheen of sweat beading over his upper lip. He pulled his baseball cap down tighter, so there was more of a shadow in his eyes. And then, well, he took a deep breath. It lifted him up. I blinked. It lifted him up? Charlie nodded. A desperate, scared nod. Like, suspended him. Off the ground? I asked, picking up my pen again and scribbling in earnest. "No," Charlie said, his voice coming out as a croak. "I lifted him up. On and on and on, up to the damn sky until I couldn't see him no more." Then Charlie and I had a moment of silence of our own. A spasm built in the back of my throat, but the look on the man's face told me that this was no laughing matter. "And then?" I asked. "Then I called the police, of course," Charlie said, clearing his throat. "They didn't believe me, not that I blame them. Probably thought I had too much to drink. There wasn't any sort of evidence, but just a bit of blood in the dirt. He was gone. Totally gone." He nodded towards the stack of papers on my desk. "I read a bit of the work you do here, so I figured if anybody else thought I was out of my gourd, I might as well see what you think." I wasn't sure how to respond to this. So I knew better than to assume the man was crazy, but the alternative was much worse. So instead of saying the thing I was thinking, I said the one thing I always say to people who come to the Happetsville Gazette office looking for Sam Singer. "I'll look into it." I started with the police department, who have seen their fair share of strange and unexplained, but this story was too much for even them. They didn't suspect Charlie of any foul play, but they didn't believe his giant skyhook tale, so they chalked up his report to an old buddy trying to cover for his friend skipping out on his wife and kids. And as for the wife and son themselves, they weren't too broken-hearted about Davis being gone. They couldn't get them to talk too much, but from what I understand, Davis was far more interested in other hobbies than being a family man. So he wasn't around much, I said to Deborah, Davis's wife, as she stared at me through her screen door. I hadn't been invited inside, but that didn't mean I wasn't going to ask a few questions, as long as I was there. He wasn't around at all, Deborah said with a scoff. He was always at that Rotary Club, or fishing in the lake. Anywhere but here. I could hear her kids' cartoons playing somewhere in the background. If what Charlie had told me was true, the kid wasn't abandoned. Their father was more than likely dead. I said with an absent-minded nod. I jotted a few notes down in my notebook, but honestly, I wasn't getting much from this home visit. Even less than I got from the police. Though it was going to be difficult, I feared I was going to have to tell Charlie the truth. But I couldn't help him. Thank you for your time, ma'am, I said as I turned to leave the Nielsen house. And then I stopped. There's something about what Deborah Nielsen had said was odd. He was always at the Rotary Club. Or fishing at the lake. The lake. Now, there are many bodies of water in Habitsville, mostly small creeks and a few ponds, but there's only one place that we ever referred to as the lake. Mrs. Nielsen, I said quickly, stepping back towards the door. The woman came back into view behind the screen, looking impatient. When you say your husband was always fishing at the lake? I paused. Do you mean that Mr. Nielsen was fishing in Lake Lura? I hadn't expected her to laugh, but that's exactly what she did. You should see your face, kiddo, she said. Don't tell me you believe all that small-town superstition. Davis sure didn't, and I don't neither. She chuckled one more time, and then her grin fell, and her mouth hardened into a thin line. Davis didn't disappear in a lake. Fairies and leprechauns didn't drag him off, and I'm sure as shit Santa had nothing to do with this, if you want to jot that down too. She turned her head over her shoulder, back towards the sound of the cartoons and the TV. When she spoke next, her voice was low. David Nielsen was a lousy husband and father. He's taken his son to one ball game, maybe to walk around the forest once. He's a deadbeat. She practically spat that last word. Then she shook her head. He's told me he's walking out on us about 100 times. Looks like he finally did. And then the door shut behind the screen. If David Nielsen had had any other fishing hole, my investigation would have ended right there. Between the lack of evidence and tipsy witness, there was no reason to think anything out of the ordinary had happened to Davis. But Lake Lura changes everything. If you've read my other account of the strange happenings surrounding Lake Lura, you too might share the feeling of dread that gripped me as I left the Nielsen house. It's a mysterious pool hidden in the woods, where no one dares swim or drink, not even animals. People go missing around Lake Lura, or lost objects float to the surface, and no one in the history of Habitsville has ever truly found the bottom. Or, if you're me, you fall into the water and nearly drown, and, of course, are treated to a disturbingly realistic vision of your own death. At least I've convinced myself it was a vision. But all that's besides the point, because Davis Nielsen was nowhere near the Lake Lura when he disappeared. The Rotary Club's at least 8 miles away. Even by the time I got back to the Habitsville Gazette office, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake wasn't just a coincidence. There's no such thing as coincidences, as far as I'm concerned. And that's why, once I got to my desk, I called Charlie Danes. He answered on the second ring and immediately asked me if I found anything about Davis's disappearance. And I felt a little bit guilty when I said no. There was a disappointed silence, but then I asked my question, or the reason I'd called. Charlie, did you ever go fishing with Davis? The other man said nothing. But it wasn't the ordinary quiet of idle conversation. This was a heavy pause, where something unsaid hung in the air. No, he answered in a hushed voice. Why not? Not much of a fishing kind of guy? I asked, probing carefully. There was another long pause. There just ain't many good fishing spots in town, he said gruffly, his tone dismissive. Well, apparently there's one good place, I said. Mrs. Nielsen informed me that Davis likes to go cast a line in Lake Lura. Now this was the longest pause of all. A deafening quiet. So still I could count each individual crack of the telephone line where Charlie's stubble brushed the receiver. Then the man spoke. I always told him he was stupid for going there. I'd been speaking slowly and deliberately, trying not to betray too much earnest. But when Charlie started to admit that there was something off about the lake, something he might have warned Davis about, I jumped at the chance to find out more. Why, Charlie? I asked quickly. Oh, and why is it stupid to go fishing in Lake Lura? Silence. I gotta go. I got something over the stove. Click. I spent the rest of my day at my desk debating. The evidence was stacking against Davis and against Charlie's completely bizarre account of what had happened to him. Davis's family wasn't interested in getting him back. Neither were the police. If anything, I should be suspicious of Charlie. In any other town, he would sound psychotic. But not in Habitsville. As my coworkers left and the sun set, there was only one thing for me to do. The drive to Lake Lura was rough, and at a certain point, I had to get out to walk. Though it's been almost a year since I've traveled the woods around the lake, I still knew my way around. And I couldn't forget it if I tried. That didn't mean I was surprised when I actually saw the lake itself. I had forgotten that for all of its stories and superstitions, it was only a small pool of water. The closer I got, the more I could recall the feeling of it. The eerie silence of the woods surrounding it, like every living creature was holding its breath. The glassy mirrored surface that never wavered in the breeze, and of course the dark, murky water that went down, down, down endlessly. But there was something else there too, something I hadn't expected. Charlie. Sitting on the bank of the lake was Charlie Danes. He was holding something in his hands, something small, and as I neared closer, I could see that Charlie Danes was staring down at a fishing rod. A child's fishing rod. Mr. Danes? I said. He didn't answer. Charlie. He didn't look up, but he spoke. Do you know what happens when you cast a hook in the Lake Lura, boy? My heart rate sped up at the way his voice growled, low and grave. No, sir, I don't. I say if you cast a line in the Lake Lura, he said, the fish gets angry. Charlie still didn't look away from the child's fishing rod, and I didn't look away from him. I was confused, to say the least. The boy needs his father, he said quietly. And then, somehow, I knew. Charlie's hands started shaking, and his head was low, and at first I thought he might be crying, but when he finally lifted his face, I saw his skin flushed with fury, his teeth grit with anger. I told him not to fish here, he yelled at me from the other side of the lake. I told him that! I told him! Before I could say anything, Charlie stood up and reached for the rocks that littered the bank of the lake. And with as much strength as he could, he started throwing them against the water's surface. The rocks cracked into the liquid like breaking glass, and all the while Charlie was yelling a frenzied mourning string of obscenities and regrets. He didn't deserve that. He didn't deserve... I should have... Charlie, I called to him. But he didn't look at me. He was breathing hard, and after he threw the last rock, he looked around for more, but found none. Then he picked up the child's fishing rod again. He stared at it for a minute, grunting with exhaustion and anguish. Then he raised it above his head and he threw it into the center of the lake. For a moment, it just floated on the surface. It was a kid's fishing rod, after all, not a very expensive one. My guess was that Davis had gotten it for his son for maybe one fishing trip and then never went again. But of course his son never forgot. We stood there for a moment. The water settled back to stone. Charlie and I on either side. "Charlie," I called out to him. "You need to calm..." I was interrupted. I was interrupted by something terrible. It was huge, wet, and dark. It rose out of the water so quickly, I only caught a glimpse of it. Waves crashed on either side, splashing my legs, but all I could look at was the awful gaping maw that came from the depths. It didn't have teeth. I don't know why I expected that it would, like a huge earthworm. It was all gums that had skin that looked like rubber, glistening and gelatinous in the light of the sunlight. Like the exposed blubber of a whale. I braced myself for death, braced myself to see Charlie die, but neither death occurred. Instead, the mouth closed around the floating fishing rod and sank back beneath the surface. Charlie and I said nothing. We only shuddered. Charlie collapsed onto his knees, his jeans darkening on the soaked sand. I was in shock, there was no doubt about that. Which is why, when I started to see it come down from the sky, my mouth couldn't form words. I couldn't yell out. I couldn't warn him. I don't think he even saw it coming. But nonetheless, swinging down from above came the hook. In the stillness of Lake Lura, I could hear the sickening squelch it made as it entered through the back of Charlie's chest, and I could see the red tip emerge from between two buttons of his flannel. Head shaking violently, he looked down at it. He gurgled only once, a scarlet drip working its way down his chin, and then he turned his head to the sky. Charlie Danes was hoisted up by the hook, and he just kept going. I stared into the coming dusk for long after I could see him anymore, and long after I might have been able to tell exactly where he went. I came back to Lake Lura at dawn the next morning. I didn't even look at the water. I didn't think about the fish or why it took Davis Nielsen instead of his son. Instead, I took a hammer and I sunk something into the ground, right on the bank of the lake. A wooden sign I had hand-painted the night before. It read, "No fishing allowed." I turned to leave, hoping, praying that this time I would truly never return. And then I heard it. Unnoticeable at a normal pond. But at Lake Lura, you take note of any noise that breaks the perpetual silence. A distinct splash made me turn my head in horror, afraid that the monstrous mouth had broken the surface once more. But what I saw was much smaller. Tiny, jelly-like creature skating along the water surface, perfectly at ease. It was rubbery, slimy, had no eyes or fins that I could see. Just a mouth that kept opening as it swam, toothless and wide. I left quickly and quietly. I knew I had seen something frightening, something more terrifying than the humongous creature I had seen breach the top of the lake that evening before. I had seen something even more disturbing than the image of Charlie yanked up into the sky on a metal hook. Something worse still than his feet dangling helplessly, one shoe untied as he was pulled up and out of existence. I'd seen a baby. Hey there kids, it's me, Mr. Creepypasta, and before we get started on tonight's story, I'm going to tell you a little bit about tonight's author. Tonight's author, The Vespers Bell, has a subreddit r/The Vespers Bell and is a featured writer on r/Odd Directions. Odd Directions has daily exclusive stories written by featured writers and carefully curated guest writers, ensuring that all their content is of consistent quality. Also, Vespers Bell has a book available right now on Amazon called The Horrorwick Chronicles Volume 1. And just in time for Halloween, The Horrorwick Chronicles Volume 2 should be available in the link in the description down below. And now, just in time for this evening, on to tonight's story. My grandpa Chuck is a baby boomer, and without a doubt, the most quintessentially boomer thing my grandpa does is maintain a display room. It's basically a second living room, except instead of IKEA, it's filled with artisanal luxury European furnishings, which no one is allowed to lay a finger on. They're china cabinets filled with multiple sets of fine china that have never once been used. All manner of collectibles decorate every surface, and the only time they've ever been moved since they've been in that room is when my grandpa cleans the place. There's even an antique piano, even though he couldn't play chopsticks if his life depended on it. It's just a whole room filled with the most expensive things my grandpa could afford, treated as sacred cows of consumerism, none of which he dared to get any practical use out of. I mean, it's not that weird. Not for a boomer, anyway. But what is weird is that he keeps a television in there. No one's supposed to be in that room, and I always thought that putting a television in there would just encourage people to use it. It's not a big TV either. And as far as I know, the only thing that really makes TVs expensive is their size. I did ask my grandpa about it once, about why it deserved a place in his display room, and all he would say was that they don't make them like that anymore. Late last year, before vaccines were available here, Grandpa caught COVID, and he was in the hospital for a little while. I asked if I could house sit for him, and he was slowly dying of the coronavirus, and his number one concern was that his stuff was okay. Pure boomer energy right there. Regardless of what I thought of his priorities, I agreed so that he wouldn't be worried and he could focus on getting better. Wrote down a rather extensive list of rules for what to do and what not to do, some of which were exasperatingly neurotic, but not really out of the ordinary. That is, until it came to the television in the display room. Here's what he wrote. Number 1. When cleaning the display room, do not touch the television set except for any of the reasons listed below. Number 2. If the cabinet doors are open, close them immediately. Number 3. When the television is off, do not look at your reflection on the screen. Number 4. Don't sit too close to the television, on or off. Number 5. If the television is on, turn it off immediately, and remember that TV isn't real. Number 6. When it's on, be careful not to bring your hand close enough to feel static on the screen. Number 7. If it doesn't turn off, leave the house immediately and call me. Don't try to unplug it. Number 8. Never change the channel. And number 9, if you fail to follow these rules and there's an incident with the television, do not destroy it. He doesn't make them like that anymore. I wasn't honestly all that concerned about this. My grandpa knew I was curious about his mysterious old television. I figured he was just trying to mess with me. I'd been in his house lots of times before, and I had no reason to believe that the television was dangerous or supernatural in any way. I settled into my grandpa's house and went straight to work, attending to his lengthy list of instructions. It was mostly yard work, even though there was no garden, just a large crop of homogeneous grass under the vigilant gaze of ceramic gnomes and plastic flamingos, all of which he was inordinately proud of. Any weed or wildflower that dared to rear its non-conforming head was living on borrowed time, and if any of his neighbors' creeping ivy got onto his side of the fence on my watch, there'd be hell to pay. Being busy and outdoors most of the day, it wasn't until I was eating my dinner that evening that I noticed it. The sound of electric static. I didn't notice it all at once. It was more of a gradual awareness that I was hearing a very faint white noise I couldn't account for. I silenced every appliance or electronic that I could to listen for it, and I realized that it was television static. I followed the sound into the hallway, and in the gap between the display room's door and the floor, I could see the flickering light of a television set. I was momentarily unsettled by this revelation, since it was an old clunker of a television, one that shouldn't have been able to turn itself on. I quickly dismissed the thought as irrational, though. My grandpa must have left it on before he went into the hospital, either by accident or on purpose, just to mess with me, and both the sound and the light had been too faint for me to notice before. Remembering his list of rules regarding the television, and fully aware there might be some kind of a prank waiting for me inside, I cautiously opened the door and I stepped into the terraced room of expensive and useless junk. It was as immaculate as I remembered it, seemingly not a single item having been moved since the last time I was there. The entire room was bathed in nothing but the monochromatic flickering from the staticky television, which made everything seem about 10 times creepier than it did in the light of day. The only lamp in the room wasn't plugged into the correct socket for the light switch to work, so I didn't bother trying to turn it on. I figured I would turn off the TV and then use the light on my phone to see my way out. Since I saw no evidence of any booby traps that my grandpa might have laid for me, I headed towards the television, diligently watching my step as I did so. The cabinet doors were wide open, which was weird in and of itself, as my grandpa always kept them shut. I was supposed to shut them too after turning the TV off, but I couldn't help but take a moment to examine it while I had the chance. It looked like a classic 1950s television set, with a wooden box frame, bulging glass screen, and knobs for controls. But right below the screen, in shiny brass letters, was the word Inglorious Retrovision. This was confusing to me, since that implied it was a recreation. I saw that there was a framed letter hanging on the inside of the cabinet door, and while it was hard to read in the dim and consistent light, I was able to make out that it was a letter of certification. It stated that the television in question was a genuine Inglorious Retrovision, made by an individual called Vladia Dragovic, followed by some nonsense about it using special crystals for transceiving waves in the panpsychic aether. So that's what made it special then. It was a joke? Some sort of uncharacteristic meta commentary on the room itself by my grandfather? I shook my head in confusion and reached down to turn the television off. I jolted my hand back when I saw a face in the static staring back at me. "Hey there, Ducky." The face grinned. It looked like a young woman's face, her dark brown hair worn in girlish bunches, her smile equal parts sweet and sinister. I shrieked at the sight of her, stepping backwards and slamming the cabinet door shut as I did so. I was left in almost complete darkness at that point, the only light being whatever flickering static managed to seep through the cracks in the cabinet door. "Now that wasn't very nice of you," the girl chastised me, pouting a little as she did so. "I just wanted to say hi. Is this your first time using an Inglorious Retrovision? I've never seen you on here before." "You can see me through the television?" I stammered. I hadn't noticed any sort of camera built in or connected to the television screen. "Of course, Ducky. It's like a telescreen from 1984, the girl replied. "My name's Mary, by the way. Mary darling. What's yours?" Chris, I answered, hoping that would be sufficient. "Hello, Chris. A pleasure to meet you," she said sweetly. "Would you mind opening the cabinet doors so I could see you? My brother's out and I'm so bored. I just want to talk to somebody." I froze, unsure of what to do. My grandfather's list made it very clear that I should shut the television off immediately. But this girl, if that's even what she was, had taken notice of me, and I was getting an extremely strong vibe that she was not someone I wanted to offend. Yeah, Sure, no problem. Sorry I slammed them shut on you like that. You startled me, is all, I said, unconvincingly as I slowly pulled open the cabinet doors to reveal her smirking, staticky face. Yeah, I tend to startle people a lot, she said, playfully twirling her right pigtail. This is Chuck's retrovision, right? How do you know him? He's my grandpa, actually, I blurted, immediately regretting it. You're friends with him, I take it? No, not exactly. He usually tunes out the instant he sees I've tuned in, she admitted. But I manage to catch him off guard every now and then, though. I swallowed nervously, wondering what it was about this strange girl that had made my grandfather so diligently avoid her. I glanced down at the television set, looking for the power button. I wouldn't do that, Ducky, she said, except this time her voice came from behind me and was free of any static distortion. I spun around and I saw her sitting on the couch. Lit by the glow from the accursed television, her hair was pitch black, her eyes baby blue, and her silk bathrobe, lipstick, and nail polish were all bright red. She held a cherry-garnished martini in one hand, a cigarette in the other, and tucked into the sash of her robe were several gleaming kitchen knives, which became orders of magnitude more frightening just through association with her. I couldn't process how she had gotten there. It seemed impossible, but since she wasn't acting hostile at the moment, I was more dumbfounded than terrified. Though I was still plenty terrified. How did you get there? I'm not. This is just a projection. You're perfectly safe, Ducky, she said as she took a sip of her martini. No, I never leave my playroom without my brother James. A woman's place is in the home, especially when that home is an extra-dimensional pocket of space-time that she can bend to her every whim. James goes out on his own when we need to play things or other supplies, and he enjoys the challenges working within this reality poses. Me, though, I prefer being perpetually drunk on the sense of godlike, nigh omnipotence I get from ruling our little playroom. Now, I get bored when he's out, though, like I said, so I play around with the retrovision, see who's watching. Come, sit beside me. I'll show you how this thing works. I couldn't smell her cigarette at all, which seemed to corroborate her claim that she wasn't really there. That meant that I was safe for the moment, it seemed. It also meant that I could run away. But that seemed likely to upset her and might end up biting me in the ass down the line. Humoring her seemed like the least risky thing to do. So I politely sat beside her. You said that you being a projection meant I was safe. Why wouldn't I be safe if you were really here? You don't look that dangerous. Well, that's kind of the point. If I were a grotesque monster instead of a pretty girl, you'd probably have done the smart thing and ran out of here as fast as you could. She grinned at me. But since you asked, I'm actually a cannibalistic serial killer, as cliché as that sounds. I chuckled as affably as I could, only for her to take a drag of her cigarette, as she glared at me in disdain. I'm not joking, she said coldly. Between us, my brother and I kill at least dozens of people every year, and I haven't gone a day without eating human flesh since I was a kid. I've always got bits of someone else in my intestines, since I use it in all my cooking. And when I was young, I even served it to my parents. I told them I got the meat from home economics class. And when I killed my parents, I served some of them to my home economics class, and I told them I got the meat from home. It's not just fun, it's healthy, too. A human body has everything the human body needs. You just have to avoid the brain because of the prions, and my cannibalism is purely culinary, by the way. I have no respect for survival cannibalism. I don't abandon my principles when things get rough. Sorry, I can see you sick of me shoving my lifestyle down your throat. It's a shame I'm not really here. Because then I could literally shove my cooking down your throat. Oh well. Let's see what's on TV. She set down her martini and pulled out an old-fashioned remote from her robe. My grandpa said not to change the channel, I protested weakly, knowing it would be useless. Oh, he left you some rules for this, did he? She asked as she threw her head back in laughter. Yeah, I'm not so big on rules. With a click of a button, the static-filled screen changed into a monochromatic scene of what looked like an occult office or study. There were Gothic bookshelves, a big and ornate desk with a leather chair, and a multitude of antique chests stacked around the room. Be very quiet, she whispered to me with a mischievous smile. Since I'm using your retrovision, you won't know it's me right away.
The hell I won't, darling. You think I can't recognize that eldritch aura of yours on a different frequency?
A cantankerous old man shouted from somewhere off-screen.
Stay off my psi waves, or so help me I'll personally see that you end up crammed into the same floating box as your Uncle Larry.
A dark form briefly moved in front of the screen, before it went back to static. All right, I guess that's not gonna work, she said, disappointed, but not upset. That's okay, though. There are things besides other retrovisions putting out strong enough signals that can be picked up. She started flipping through the channels rapidly, most of them containing nothing but more static, a few of them containing semi-coherent images and half-audible sounds, but she never stayed on those long enough for me to get a good grasp of what they actually were. It wasn't until she found her first clear image that something seemed to grab her attention. There on the screen was a hooded hunchback figure perched atop some stone ruins like a gargoyle, leaning on a strange shepherd's crook. Its head looked vaguely like the skull of an elephant or a mammoth, with a singular cyclopean orifice in the front. The orifice held a small glowing light, deep with its abyssal darkness. But I couldn't tell if it was supposed to be a mouth, an airway, a sensory organ, or all three. Beneath the orifice were a pair of long, tentacle-like appendages. It fell to nearly the creature's waist. Pairs of spiracles and wispy tendrils ran all along their tapering length until each ended in a sharp, hooked talon. The creature's fingers, clawed and twice as long as they would be on a human, numbered exactly 7. 4 on the right hand, 3 on the left. The slender extra digit appearing to be a specialized and possibly vestigial appendage. Its feet were digigrade, almost velociraptor-like, and it seemed like there was at least one more tentacle or possibly a tail hiding under those robes. But other than that, it was humanoid. Despite that, something about it was deeply unsettling, deeply abhorrent, deeply wrong. Finally, something good, Mary squealed in delight. Is that thing real? I asked her, still unaware of how the retrovision was supposed to work. Well, he's not from this reality, so arguably no, she smiled. He's a wanderer, planeswalker. He's from another level of existence altogether. I can tell from his aura. You mean it's an alien? An extra-dimensional alien, yes, but I've never seen his kind before. You don't believe me, do you? Well, I mean, what makes you think it's not just a guy in a suit, or an animatronic, or CGI? I mean, it wouldn't exactly look out of place on the set of a sci-fi movie. I told you, I can tell from his aura that he's not from this plane. But if for some reason the word of a cannibalistic serial killer isn't good enough for you, why don't you go in for a closer look? These screens have surprisingly good resolution. Her tone made it clear that her suggestion was actually in order, so I obediently got up and cautiously approached the television. Upon closer look, I could see that the creature wore a leather vembrace on its left arm, with 3 glowing hemispherical discs on it, along with various other clockwork accoutrements. A belt around its waist bore a similar design, and its robes had been spun from a strange sort of silk, with angular fractals embroidered into them. Such fine, if odd, garments upon so monstrous a creature were part of what made it so unsettling. Its inhuman, no, unearthly anatomy marked it as something utterly alien. But it had clad itself in what I could recognize as the trappings of both civilization and erudition. It stood oddly still, silently peering out into the night around it like an ambush predator waiting in silence for prey to walk by. I couldn't see much other than the creature itself, but from what I could tell, it was alone, and no one else had noticed it yet. I studied its skin closely, trying to discern if it was a silicone or digital illusion, but as far as I could tell, it looked like living cephalopod skin to me. I peered in closer and closer, bringing my face so close to the screen that I could feel the strong static field on my nose. And that's when the creature jolted its head towards me, the glowing dot in its orifice darting around like the lure of an anglerfish. I pulled back from the screen so quickly, I toppled backwards, landing halfway on the couch where Mary was laughing hysterically. "Oh my god, did it see me? Did it see me?" I screamed before she could answer. There was a tapping at the window. We both turned to see the creature standing outside, drumming at the glass with one of its clawed tentacles. I bolted for the door, but when I threw it open, the creature had translocated again and was blocking my path, this time with both its mouth tentacles arced upwards like two cobras, poised to strike. Even with its hunched posture, it was just barely shorter than the doorframe, and I had no choice of muscling past it. My only way to escape was breaking through the window, but what good would that do against a being that could teleport? I didn't dare to fight it either, so instead, I just fell flat on my ass and begged for my life. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I wasn't looking for you, I didn't even know what you are, I wouldn't know how to find you again if I had to. She was the one who did it. If you're worried about being found again, take her, please, I'm no threat to you." "Oh, I love it when they beg," Mary chortled as she ate the cherry from her martini. "Almost as much as I love a good snuff film. Strangle him with those snake arms of yours and gut him like a fish." At that moment, I had no reason to believe that the creature could understand either of us. It looked down at me, then up at Mary, then over to the old television set. It tapped a claw on the device on its wrist, and the channel changed to show Mary sitting in her living room, her gleeful, sadistic expression instantly turning to one of dismay. "Oh, shit. Oh, shit. Oh, shit," she cursed as she fumbled with the remote. The projection of her vanished immediately, but she seemed to be having some trouble turning her own retrovision off. The strange creature looked down at me one last time, its orifice and tentacles somehow forming an expression that I read as a kindly smile. "It's outrageous what they allow on TV these days," it remarked in an echoey, deadpan voice, which may have just been in my head. The creature teleported again, this time reappearing on the television with Mary. She shouted and pulled out her knives, but the creature dodged her blows and grabbed her arm in its tentacles. The walls of the room had begun to melt, and then I turned off the TV. It was pitch black in the room, but in the screen's dull afterglow, I could just make out my reflection. Deciding I should follow at least one of my grandpa's rules, I slammed the cabinet doors shut before the image could register in my brain. Then I got the hell out of there. I don't know what happened between Mary and the creature, and so long as I never see either of them again, I don't care. I called my grandpa. Told him what happened and that I couldn't stay in that house anymore. Fortunately, he was understanding, but not exactly forthcoming on anything he knew about what I had been through. When he got out of the hospital, the first thing he did was check on his display room. I mean, nothing was broken or missing or even out of place. With one exception. A kitchen knife was embedded into the couch. Exactly where I had been sitting. It looked like it had been thrown straight from the television, or as impossible as it sounds, through it. Mary had tried to kill me at some point, it seemed. Even from the other side of the screen. She had missed her shot, and I, mesmerized by what I saw on the TV screen, failed to notice. Small wonder, then, that my grandpa always kept the TV cabinet doors closed. This happened a while ago. Not entirely sure why I chose to talk about it now, though. I kinda do. I'll explain later. I have a bit of a bad habit of dozing off on the train. I don't blame it entirely on myself. My place of employment necessitates that I work long, hard, and obscure hours. More often than not, I find myself taking the very last train home at around 2 a.m. My stop's at the end of the line, so my whole trip takes me about 35 minutes. And of course, I'm tired as hell by the end of it. Also, sometimes I get drunk. It happens. It's not like I want to fall asleep. I mean, I could get pickpocketed, or worse. It is what it is. Nobody's perfect. But it usually isn't a problem. Like I said, my stop's at the end of the line, so the driver would always wake me up when he comes by to do his inspection of the cars. This has become such a routine that I know each and every one of the nighttime drivers by face. There's only 3, though. Not much of a feat. And one of them's quiet, a gruff-looking gentleman in his mid-50s. One's even older, South Asian man, appearing to be in his 60s at least. The last guy was younger, probably mid-20s. This guy's always extremely messy hair. The roster of drivers had remained the same for the past 3 to 4 years, all super nice guys, mind you. I had no reason to complain. I knew these people, and I was comfortable with them. I expected to see them. So you can imagine my shock when I woke up to see an unfamiliar face staring down at me one night. I'd been out drinking. I was about 2 or 3 beers away from throwing up my insides. Safe to say, I'm not in the most alert state. It was still a jarring sight nonetheless. And this guy must have stared at me for 10 seconds straight without saying a word. His appearance certainly didn't help either. I'm not one to judge on looks, but this dude, he was beyond freaky. You ever seen Lost Highway? Remember that phone call scene with the mystery man? That's roughly what he resembled. I'm a bit younger, though. His face was nearly ghostly pale. His eyes were wide and beady. His smile was unsettling at best, and insanity-inducing at worst. On top of that, there was a hole in his neck. A fucking hole. And I could see straight through it. "You've reached the end of the line," he said. His voice was normal enough, especially given his throat. But his tone sounded like the one a child would make when he knew about something that his friend didn't. Yeah, sorry. I guess I dozed off again. It took all the strength I had not to focus on his neck hole, especially if the other option I had was to look into his eyes. He stopped leering at me and stood straight. He must have been about 6'6" or 2 meters tall, also strangely muscular for his height. An intimidating presence, to say the least. He stood still for a moment, trapping me in place, and I was expecting him to say something after all, but he didn't. Instead, he just took off. After taking a second to adjust to the weirdness, I got off and began walking to the doors. I'd never been more ready to go home at that point, but the door didn't open. I pressed the button, but nothing happened. What the hell? I muttered, concern starting to rise in my chest. It hadn't even been 15 seconds since the driver got off. It didn't take long for me to start shoulder checking the door, and then I started yelling. There were only 2 options in my mind at this point. The door better open the fuck up, and this train better not start fucking moving. It was my lucky day, because none of those things happened. "Hello? Driver?" I yelled as the train departed. What the fuck? I'm still here!" Unfortunately, I was in one of the middle cars, so he couldn't hear me. One of my coworkers, Alan, had been on the train with me before I passed out. I also knew for a fact that he also got off at the end of the line, but I was alone. He was nowhere to be seen. I continued slamming on the doors and pressing the emergency stop button, but one thing was quickly becoming certain. This thing wasn't stopping. I sat down and I resigned to my sudden fate. What the hell's going on? I thought to myself. The situation was truly bizarre. The driver would have had to sprint to the cab, prevent the doors from opening, and then drive off. I mean, this was all with the knowledge that some guy might still be on the train. What the fuck was his problem? Truth be told, I had no idea where the trains went after hours. I just hoped that it wouldn't be too far. After all, my city wasn't huge, and the tracks had to end at some point. I looked out the windows, but it was mostly dark. A few buildings still had lights on, but not many. Not surprising in the dead of night. I tried calling Alan, but he wouldn't pick up. I cursed again. 15 minutes passed, and I was starting to lose it. What the hell is this shit? I thought. We were approaching the edge of the city. I was 99% certain that the tracks did not extend this far. I felt like I was having a fever dream. My hands were shaking. I was on the brink of hyperventilating. To combat that, I closed my eyes and I started taking deep breaths. It's fine. It's alright, I thought. Driver's just a fucking idiot. I mean, maybe I'll be compensated for this shit show. Yeah. Free transit for a year. I mean, that's the least they could offer me. After calming myself down, I opened my eyes back up. It was still dark. I nearly screamed in frustration. I felt around me, confirming that I was definitely still on the train. Why are the lights off? It sounded like we were going through a tunnel, but even tunnels had lights. None of them were pitch black all the way through. Something else bothered me as well, the vague sensation of a presence sitting right across from me. I sat utterly still for what felt like 5 minutes. Eventually, the train lights came back on. It was still empty. Even my mind was starting to play tricks on me. I looked out the window, but it was still black. I took my phone out and dialed 911. It rang a few times before someone picked up. "Hello?" I said. "Hello?" Nothing, just breathing on the other end. "Can you say something?" I screamed into the phone. Somebody finally responded, but it was in a language I couldn't recognize. Not just one I didn't understand. I mean, I knew what French sounds like, even though I can't speak it. But I'd never heard this dialect before in my entire life. I could only describe it as serpent-like. The mere sound of it made my skin feel like something was slithering beneath it. I hung up and I buried my face in my hands. "This is not happening. This is not happening," I muttered to myself. I repeated this, hoping that it would cause me to wake up. Didn't really feel like a dream, but then again, we don't really know what dreams feel like, do we? Soon enough, the train came to a stop. I was glad, of course, but at the same time, I wasn't exactly excited to find out where the hell I was. I looked out the window. I think my heart nearly stopped. I didn't know what the hell I was supposed to be looking at. It almost resembled a desert, but a post-apocalyptic one. Everything was gray, including the sky. There were gigantic trees scattered throughout, along with massive vortex-like pits. Large, hunched figures were wearing baggy black robes that dragged themselves across the sand. I couldn't tell from so far, but it almost looked like they had beaks coming out of their faces. "We've arrived." I jumped at the sudden outburst. I turned around, seeing the driver standing at the door, smiling at me. "Where the fuck am I?" He angled his head and grinned even wider. "You'll want to get off before they get on," he said. "The next station is not for you. You have 1 hour before your returning train arrives. Have fun exploring." He started to leave, but turned back before he did. "Also, don't go out into the desert." This time, the door stayed open after he left. The place we arrived at looked more or less like a regular station, if not a bit outdated. It was also gray, just like the desert outside. There were also people sitting on benches just outside the train. Well, I suppose they were people. They looked just like the driver, pale, holes in throats, oddly tall, well-built. One of them suddenly got up and began approaching the train. I remembered what the driver had told me, and immediately I got off. From there, I ran the length of the train. I finally spotted him in the driver's cab. I pounded on his window, managing to catch his attention. "Hey, what the hell's going on?" I asked him through the glass. I wasn't sure if he didn't hear me, or if he was just being a huge asshole, but he just grinned at me and waved. Seconds later, he just started driving, leaving me in that godforsaken place. At the very least, the station was now empty. I walked over and I sat on one of the benches. I took out my phone and I tried checking the time. Yeah, I say tried, because everything on my screen was now in gibberish, presumably the language that I'd heard earlier. 1 hour. I just had to wait for 1 hour and then I'd be back. Or I'd wake up. Hopefully the latter. But before it even felt like 5 minutes, something wandered onto the platform. I didn't look over at it, however, I was sure as hell this thing was looking at me. From the corner of my eye, it appeared like one of those hunched figures that had been out in the desert. I saw it shift in place before it started squawking like some kind of fucked up demon bird. I left almost immediately as it did. So much for my plan of sitting still. I saw a set of stairs go up and headed towards it. Once up, I found myself in what looked like a regular terminal. Just like the platform was a bit off. I mean, the architecture was hard to identify. Definitely unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was almost retro and futurist at the same time, with large banners and monitors displaying strange symbols set up just about everywhere. It's like they hired a doomsday cult to design the place. The place was populated by more of those neckhole people. Thankfully, they didn't seem to acknowledge me. I decided to walk around for a while, hoping the hunched things would be gone once I headed back. Maybe a minute later, everybody stopped and directed death stares at me. Their expressions were so full of malice, I could feel my skin begin to crawl. I noticed that some of the eyes weren't directed at me, but at the space behind me. I slowly turned my head, seeing the hunched creature had followed me up. I got a good look at it this time, and I'll probably never forget the sight of it. And I was right, it had a beak, a large one. Its face nearly resembled some kind of alien bird-human hybrid. I stood still and I began silently praying, not sure for what exactly. Almost in unison, the people opened their mouths at an unnervingly wide degree, and they began screaming, as if this was a nightmare. This would have been the moment that I woke up, but I didn't. The people began boxing me in, still screaming like damn banshees. And I'd take a step forward, the crowd would move with me. The creature was also so hot on my trail the entire time. Eventually, I just started running. I tried breaking through the crowd a few times, but I would just get pushed in another direction. And after some time of this, I was pinballed out of the terminal entirely. These bastards had directed me into the desert, along with the hunched creature. And once I was out, they stopped screaming. They shut the terminal door behind them. The creature began squawking again before lurching at me, and I could do nothing but run as it chased me. And soon enough, every single creature in the vicinity was also on my ass. It was like a nightmarish chain reaction. There were numerous times where I nearly ran into one of those swirling pits, and there was definitely something dwelling inside them. I could hear it, the sickening, slithering sounds of something large within. There was no end in sight. It was obvious that I couldn't run forever, and the creatures started getting closer. I could see them up close. Their beaks were wide open with long, spiky tongues hanging out of them. The sight of it pushed me to continue running, but I wasn't superhuman. My lungs gave out before my legs did, but right before that, I could see a figure walking towards me. Not one of those hunched things. It was something familiar. But I passed out before I could find out. When I woke up, I was back on the train. I reeked of sweat and my joints ached, but I was nevertheless happy to be alive. But what the hell happened, I thought. I told you not to go into the desert. I looked over, seeing the driver once again standing by the door. Look, I didn't really have a choice. What the fuck's wrong with this place? I said. The driver raised an eyebrow at me. I thought you would have come better prepared. That's usually the case. Better prepared? I asked, taken aback by the statement. What the hell are you talking about? I never planned on being here. Whatever the goddamn hell this place is. This time, he was the one to look confused. Is that so? Well, I doubt you found this place on accident. Maybe something else is going on. Once you're back in your world, I advise you to be careful. This is a dangerous game to play. Well, I'd better be going. Wait, I said. Why did you save me? It is strange, he responded. I usually wouldn't bother with it, but you were different. Not cocky like the others. It was a breath of fresh air, and I appreciated it. He walked off the train, leaving me with about 1,000,000 questions. I didn't bother chasing after him, but at that point, I didn't have the will or energy for it. I just sat tight. Soon enough, the train started moving. Just like they had on the way there, the lights went out again. But it wasn't a problem, because soon enough the train arrived at the end of the line. The actual end of the line. I checked my phone, it was in English, now displaying 2:15 a.m. I couldn't understand how such a little time had passed, but then again, I didn't understand a lot of things from that night. And when I went to work the following Monday, I was still in a state of relative shock. I didn't want to believe what had happened, but it certainly wasn't a fucking dream. Maybe my drink got spiked at the bar or something. Talk about a delayed reaction, right? But deep down, I knew that any kind of reasoning I could conjure up was just a cope. It was an inexplicable event. I just had to accept that and never fall asleep on the train again. I saw Alan at lunch that day. I was tempted to say something about what had happened, but opted not to. I didn't want to be that crazy guy at work, after all. "Totally sorry for giving you the slip Saturday, man," he told me. "I had to get off at an earlier stop. My sister lives downtown. She was having some kind of emergency, like, geez, right?" He chuckled. I just nodded. "Anyway," he continued, "anything interesting happen on the train?" I didn't like his tone with that question. I mean, it was almost like he already knew the answer, and he just wanted to hear me say it. Also, if I'd been asleep, then why the hell would he have not woken me up before he left? Something wasn't right. "No, nothing noteworthy, no. You know how boring the city is." His smile faded. Okay. "Why do you ask?" He shook his head. "Oh, no reason. Just glad you made it home safe." I mean, that conversation shouldn't have been anything substantial. But given the circumstances, it made me wonder. I've been working from home for a few weeks now, so I haven't seen him since, but he sent me a text last night. "Hey man, let's go out once this is all over. Go crazy. You down?" I put my phone down and I thought about what the driver had told me. "I doubt that you found this place by accident." And I'm starting to think I didn't. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta. And before we get started on tonight's story, I want to let you know about a new book from tonight's author. The story is actually from said book. It is called Whispers and Screams, 13 Chilling Stories That'll Haunt Your Dreams, by Carrie Lapierre. It's available now on Kindle and paperback, and you can find the book on Amazon through the link in the description down below. And now, on to tonight's story. When Luke was a boy, he lived in a small town in Tennessee. Like most small towns, everyone knew one another and their business. It's hard to keep a secret for very long when all people can do for entertainment is gossip. And maybe that's why it seems so strange that nobody ever talked about the elephant in the room. The unspoken truth that friends and neighbors accepted as part of their lives there. It's hard to explain what it's like to an outsider, but it's almost like living amongst bees in a hive. After a while, you get used to living with something that most are afraid of. Usually when someone sees a bee, they flail around trying to get it away, even though it never seems to help. I think people do that just out of instinct. You've all heard the words, if you don't bother them, they won't bother you. Some say that if you don't run from scary things, they won't chase you. And others, like Luke, would say that sometimes there's no getting away from scary things. To really understand the story, you need to go back in time to understand the town. Luke's hometown was built in the early 1800s. The wealthy landlords built big plantation houses and planted crops, When the Civil War came, many of these homes were abandoned and torn apart by war. One of the houses was converted into a field hospital. Wounded soldiers were carried in by the thousands. The first night, over 150 soldiers died from their injuries. One of the children's rooms was converted into an operating room. Arms and legs were amputated and dropped out the window onto the lawn. The walls of that room were painted red with blood from the countless operations. The dead were buried on the property, with small stones used to mark their graves. Over the years, the stones were moved or lost, and the land was sold off. The town sprouted up around the historic hospital, which became a museum. Over the years, those who have lived there say that they've seen ghosts of young soldiers wandering the streets. Most of them are quiet and peaceful, just walking around as if on patrol. And others seem to hold on to the anger of having their life cut short and have more sinister intentions. One summer night in July, Luke and his best friend Aaron were at their favorite ice cream shop. It was closing time, and the boys were making their last-minute orders before they were shooed away by the manager. They sat down at the only clean picnic table and complained about the boredom of living in a small town. "Man, there's nothing to do here," said Aaron. "We could go fishing," offered Luke. Aaron turned him down. Luke picked up his phone as it vibrated on the table and checked the time. It was 9:15. "I don't know what you want to do tonight," said Luke, "but I have to get home soon. My mom told me to be home by 10. Aaron rolled his eyes and replied, "Don't be a baby. Let's have some fun." Aaron's idea of fun was usually something dangerous or illegal. After a second, Aaron smiled wide and looked at Luke and said, "Let's go down to the old hospital. See if there really are any ghosts like they say." Luke wanted nothing to do with this, but didn't want to sound like a chicken. The boys agreed and got in the car and drove across town. Aaron pulled off the side of the road about a quarter-mile from the house to avoid being spotted. They walked through the woods and ran around the back of the house. "How do you think we're going to get in there?" asked Luke. "Just leave it to me," said Aaron. Luke stayed there, squatting down behind the house as Aaron disappeared around the side, and just as Luke thought he would be off the hook with his stupid idea, he heard Aaron call out, "Yes!" Aaron told Luke to come over to the open bathroom window. Luke gave Aaron a boost up, and Aaron reached back down to pull Luke inside. The boys tiptoed through the house on the first floor. There was a hostess desk, a gift shop with a bunch of old pictures showing the house back when it was new. There were velvet ropes keeping people from touching the antiques. Luke looked at his phone. It was nearly 9:47 and close to curfew. "Okay, prove your point. This is dumb like I said it would be. Let's just get out of here," he said. "No way," said Aaron, as he took out his cell phone and turned on the camera. Aaron started recording a video as he disappeared up the stairs. Luke, reluctantly, followed. When Luke got upstairs, he could hear Aaron in the operating room talking to himself. "Hey, Aaron, be quiet or you're going to get caught," he whispered. As Luke got closer to the room, he heard Aaron say, "What did I tell you guys? I knew we would see a ghost." Luke could feel his heart beating in his throat. He ran over to the doorway and shouted at Aaron, "I'm serious, man!" He looked around the room, but didn't see anything. It was just an old, blood-soaked wooden table in the middle of the room with a metal chair around it to keep people from touching it. The chain was swaying back and forth, as if something had just been there. Luke could hear what sounded like heavy breathing. He figured Aaron was just playing a prank on him and hiding behind the door. He was frustrated with Aaron for being a jerk. "Whatever, man, I'm out of here," he yelled as he made his way down the stairs. When he got to the bottom of the stairs, he heard a loud bang and a painful scream of his friend. Luke dove out of the window and ran back to the car. He stood at the car for a minute, looking at the house, expecting to see Aaron come limping out laughing about tripping on something. Luke could see the figure of a man walking along the fence outside the house. It must have been a security guard making the rounds. Luke heard another scream from Aaron, and the person walking along the fence turned back towards him. And Luke took off running. He didn't stop or look back until he was at his front gate. He curled up on the floor of his front steps and he sat there panting. After a few minutes, the front door opened. It was his father. He asked what was going on and if Luke was okay. Luke jumped up and ran into the house. He told his father everything, asked if someone would check on Aaron. Luke's father told him to go upstairs and that he would handle it. Luke sat at the top of the stairs while his father called the police. He gave Aaron's name and the description of the car they were driving. After about an hour, 2 officers came to the house to talk to Luke's father on the porch. He couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but it sounded like one of them said, "It doesn't make any sense." When Luke's father was finished talking with the officers, he came inside. He told Luke that they went to the museum and looked around. He said they didn't see anything suspicious and that nothing was broken or missing. "What about Aaron? Has anyone seen him?" asked Luke. "Nobody can seem to find him. He isn't home. There's no sign of his car," said Luke's father. A few minutes went by and there was still no sign of Aaron. Aaron's parents filed a missing persons report and reported the car stolen. It wasn't until some kids were fishing in the lake down the road that the car was found. It was pulled out of the lake, but there was nothing in it. They dragged the lake for hours, but only found Aaron's cell phone. The phone was badly damaged, but the police were able to pull together some of the footage from the night he went missing. It showed Aaron filming himself, walking through the house. Aaron pointed the camera outside and said that he saw the ghost of a soldier patrolling the fence. Then they saw a door swing open behind him, and a shadow rushed past. There was a loud bang, and Aaron whipped his head around. He took a step towards the door, but it slammed shut. Aaron appeared to trip and drop the phone. The phone kept recording after it hit the floor, and all you could see was the corner of the room and Aaron's sneakers facing up. There was another loud bang, like a metal object hitting the floor, and a piercing scream. Aaron's foot flopped over on its side, and blood pooled before the screen went black. The police asked some questions, but they found no blood, weapon, or body when they searched the room, so there wasn't much of an investigation. "Hi, David. Long time, I know. Let's fix that. Remember that treehouse we used to hang out in back in the day? Let's meet up there. Have a few drinks or something. Write me back if you're in town. Your good friend, Sean." I could hardly believe the email in front of me. I couldn't believe that Sean Paul had contacted me. We were inseparable back in elementary school to junior high, drifted apart in high school, hadn't spoken since the first year of college. That was nearly 6 years ago. At the risk of sounding like a dick friend, this was certainly out of the blue. But we were really good friends, and I'd always felt guilty about not keeping in touch. With that in mind, I decided to write him back. It wouldn't hurt to see how he was doing, after all. I mean, hell, maybe we'd be able to rekindle that old friendship. Ever since starting full-time employment, my life's gotten kinda dry, so it might be a nice change of pace. Hi, Sean. Crazy hearing from you after all this time. Sure, let's meet up. I'm free this weekend. David. It felt weird signing my name off at the end there, almost like I was emailing my boss or something. I thought back to our times in the treehouse for the next few days. Couldn't help but smile. Those experiences were the innocence of youth personified. I remember reading manga, watching movies on his iPod Touch, and the one time we snuck up a few of my brother's beers, just to see what they would taste like. Not so innocent, I guess. I mean, sure, I was excited. The weekend finally came and I drove out to the local forest. When I moved out, I didn't get very far. It was about a 15-minute drive there from my apartment. We'd agreed to meet at 5 p.m., so I arrived at 4:30. On the way there, I began to wonder, what were the chances our treehouse would still be there? I mean, It was over a decade ago since we'd last gone up. Nevertheless, it wasn't a huge issue. I was sure we'd be able to just sit by the river and drink if it'd been torn down or something. Still, I was curious. Curious to see what it might look like after all these years. I still remembered exactly where it was. There's just some things that you don't forget. By the river, just right out of the clearing. It also wasn't a huge forest. My eyes lit up with nostalgia when I saw it. I suppose it looked exactly like how I remember it. Bit worse for wear, but still intact. I put down my 6-pack of beer at the trunk of the tree. I recalled the makeshift door that we'd built. At the time, we thought it was some marvel of engineering for kids our age. I mean, it was legitimate, functioning door, similar to the one that would lead into an attic. I grinned as I began climbing the wood slabs that we'd hammered into the tree all those years ago. It was our attempt at creating a ladder. I mean, honestly, it worked well enough. I was brimming with excitement as I reached the entrance. A big smile on my face. I reached up, I tried to push the door open, but nothing happened. I mean, my hand just hit a wall of unmoving wood. I looked up, and what I saw confused me to no end. Instead of the actual door we'd made, one just seemed to be crudely drawn on with marker. I stood there for a second wondering what the hell was going on. I mean, was this the wrong treehouse? I looked around the forest again. Not a chance. And like I said, there'd been some things you don't forget. I continued inspecting the space where the door should have been. It wasn't as if somebody taped or glued it shut. It was clean, unbroken wood. I climbed back down and I looked at the treehouse from the ground. Still the same way I remembered it. I mean, a little banged up after all these years, but I mean, it was still unmistakable. Vaguely cube-shaped brown wood, 2 small windows on either side, but no door. Somehow, there was no door. It bothered me so much I began searching the surrounding area. Maybe somehow this was the wrong treehouse, but despite it looking the same and being in the exact same vicinity. I searched for about 25 minutes without finding anything before calling it quits. I walked back to the treehouse and I looked up at it again. It was a puzzling situation, to say the least. I looked at my phone, seeing that it had become 5 p.m. Sean should have been arriving soon. At least I'd have somebody to share my confusion with. As I waited for him to come, I wondered why somebody would build a treehouse that you couldn't enter. I mean, how did they carve out the windows in the first place? My eyes began wandering around the forest and eventually back up to the treehouse. And then I froze in place. Somebody was staring at me through the window. They seemed to be standing a few feet back, so it was almost like looking at a shadow. I mean, I couldn't make out any facial features at all, but one thing was for sure. Sure as hell wasn't a kid. Broad shoulders gave it away. I stared at this mystery person for about a minute before they stepped back and out of view. The hair on my arm stood up as I began backing up myself. I didn't feel right. It didn't feel right at all. Soon enough, I was in an all-out sprint. I got back to my car and noticed it was still the only one in the lot. I took my phone and I texted Sean, telling him I couldn't make it, for him not to come himself, and I waited around 30 minutes for a response before finally driving off. Kept looking back at the forest the whole time, looking for that person in the treehouse. Got home a few hours ago. Sean wasn't responding yet, which worries me. Maybe he got there even before I did. And even stranger, I remember feeling a vague sense of familiarity when that person looked down at me. Almost like I'd seen them before, which was impossible. Because I literally have no memories of anybody like that. I didn't have a good look at their face. Sean texted me later that night. My hand shook as I opened my phone to read it, and I wasn't sure why. I mean, if I was getting a text from him, that meant he was safe, right? This is the message he sent me. Did you see him? I must have looked at the message for 20 minutes straight. Did you see him? I mean, I sure as hell did, but I decided to play dumb for the time being, just to see how Sean would react. Did I see who? I certainly didn't see you there. In any case, his next message caught me off guard. You know who I'm talking about. I want you to answer me seriously. I waited for a bit before responding. This was getting interesting, but not in a good way. This is how the rest of our conversation went. Who is he? So you did see him. Okay, sure, I did. So who the hell is he? You still don't remember. That's what I was expecting. Remember what? What the hell is going on? Are you going to believe what I have to say? Depends on what you're going to say. Meet me in the forest parking lot tomorrow at 6. I know that you don't remember, but I'll help you do so. This isn't something we can run away from. The entire conversation had only created more questions than it answered. I mean, what the hell was I not remembering? Why was Sean acting so fucking weird? And more importantly, who the hell was the guy in our treehouse? Sean used to be my best friend, sure, but I wasn't just gonna trust him like this. I decided to call June, a mutual friend of ours, in order to dig up some information. Unlike Sean, I actually kept in contact with her. Here's how that conversation went. David? What's up? June, do you remember Sean from junior high? She went silent for a few minutes. David? What? This better not be some kind of sick joke. Joke? How would it be a joke? Listen, I just want to know if you've talked with him lately. If you know what he's been up to. Did you see him? Yeah, I did. And he was acting really fucking weird. David, you can't go back. Go back where? See, I thought that June would act as a voice of sanity here, but that clearly wasn't going to happen. The only explanation that made sense to me was that this was all just one elaborate prank that they were both in on. Ridiculous, I know, but so are the circumstances. In the middle of our call, I got another text from Sean. Don't tell anybody about this, especially June, okay? Please don't get her involved. I was starting to get fed up with all this mystery bullshit. It was, I was ready to give Sean a piece of my mind. I was going to ask, demand that he tell me exactly what was going on and what he wanted from me, but something caught my eye before I could send the message. Somebody was standing in my backyard. My heart nearly dropped when I saw it. My porch light was on, but they were standing in the farthest corner, so I could hardly make out any explicit details. Seemed to be a tall man with broad shoulders, but that was about all I could discern. I looked down at my phone and dialed 911, but when I looked back up, the person had disappeared. Or so I thought. I turned my head slightly and realized they were actually standing on my porch. I couldn't stop myself from screaming this time. Now fully illuminated, I could see that this person was wearing a black tracksuit and one of those white plastic theater masks with a grinning mouth. It was almost too small for his face, and the sudden sight of him petrified me to the point where I couldn't move a muscle for the longest time. And eventually the man lurched forward and smashed his head into my glass door, cracking his mask in the process. Then he did it again. And again, and after the fourth time it shattered, and that's when I started running. I could hear his heavy footsteps reverberating through my empty house as I barreled out of my front door. I wasn't quite sure where to go, so I just ran into a nearby convenience store before dialing the police, and my hands shook as I told them when it happened. They said they'd send somebody right over. After calming myself down, I decided to call Sean as well. Obviously, I was still kind of pissed at him, but I needed an answer. And I needed them soon. He picked up after the first ring. Sean, can you guess what the fuck just happened to me? What? Some asshole just broke into my house. Was he wearing a mask? What? I mean, yes. How the fuck did you know? Did you call the police? Obviously. Wait, no shit. I could hear him sigh over the phone, which pissed me off even more. Look, you wanna stop playing this weird fucking game with me? I haven't seen you in forever, and then you come back into my life with this kind of bullshit? He chuckled. They really did us dirty, didn't they? Say one more line of cryptic nonsense and I'll report you to the police myself. You can't go back to your house now. They'll be waiting for you. And don't ask me who they are. I'll tell you in person. You remember that diner that we go to during our first year of college? It's been open for a few weeks. Meet me there ASAP. Why there? Because I need a beer and a coffee. Also, I think they figured out where I'm living as well. In the meantime, don't trust the cops. He hung up afterward. I stood there for the longest time trying not to let the disbelief wash over me. About a minute later, I got another call. This time it was the police. Sir, we've taken care of him. For now, we need you to come back to your house and answer some questions. Come back. I told them I'd be on my way. Which was really the only response I could give them. I thought about Sean's warning. If I trusted him, and he really had gone psycho over the years, then I was in big trouble. But at the same time, there was something in the police officer's tone I didn't quite like. You know, Sean sounded more genuine. Suppose he always had been. After a few minutes of consideration, I decided to go to the diner. I mean, at least it was a public place, and he wouldn't kill me there, right? I left the store and began to make my way over. I'd been standing in the chip aisle for a while, and the cashier looked about ready to call the cops himself, so I left my car back at my house. I was forced to take public transit, which I really didn't want to do. Now I have the virus to worry about on top of everything else. The bus was empty when I got on, so I decided to close my eyes for a minute. It'd been a long day, you know, and I thought I deserved some rest. Then I opened them back up. A few stops later, 4 more people had gotten on. They were all wearing those theater masks, all of which had varying expressions. And they were all staring right at me. No, I don't know what you would have done in a scenario like this, but I kind of just froze. I'm not sure how long it lasted. It could have been a minute, maybe 10. At one point, the bus stopped moving, and I could see the driver putting on his own mask. Not an ideal situation, to say the least. After working up some courage, I decided to make a break for it. I bolted up and I dashed down the aisle, not sure what I was expecting there. I mean, that nobody was going to try to stop me? One of the masked individuals that had gotten on was a large, burly guy. He grabbed me by the shoulder. He pulled me back before I could escape the bus. His fingers dug into my flesh as he centered me towards him. Are you going to come back? He asked. In a disturbing, monotonous tone. I didn't answer. Instead, I shrugged away from his grip and I ran off. I mean, he definitely let it happen. If he'd actually been trying to keep me in place, there's no way I would have budged. Thankfully, nobody followed me off. Instead, they just sat there watching me as the bus drove away. Things had gone from annoying to downright horrifying. I didn't get it. And what the hell did they want from me? Clearly wasn't money. They would have just held me up there. My mind kept going back to the idea that this was all just a prank. And as absurd as that was, it made the most sense. I mean, if this was the case, then I was beyond pissed at Sean. This was not something that I needed right now. I decided to walk to the diner. Thankfully, I wasn't accosted by any more people in masks on the way. I expected to enter the place and find a full camera crew waiting for me, and I was ready to chew them all out, but that just wasn't the case. Instead, I found Sean sitting at a table all alone. Oh, I thought. I guess the grand reveal will come later. I stormed over to his table, and I sat down, nearly fuming. What the hell's going on, man? What the fuck is this? He looked at me. He smiled. Face I hadn't seen in some time. I don't know if it was just for me, but looked as if he'd aged about 20 years. Nice to see you too, David. It's been a while. You know, a normal friend would just stop by for drinks or something, but I guess I shouldn't have expected that from you, you fucking psycho. I stopped myself from saying anything more. Look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. Sean chuckled. Come on, David. We never do this soppy bullshit. If I were you, I would have thought I jumped off the deep end as well. Okay, before I go any further, I need to tell you about the last time I actually saw Sean. It wasn't exactly our first interaction. We were sitting in the same diner. I stormed out on him after I called him crazy and other related synonyms. But I had a reason to do so. So he'd been weird ever since high school had begun. Started talking to me less and less, and it peaked during the last few weeks of grade 11. We never even exchanged a word. Then he spent the entire 12th grade being homeschooled. I had no idea what the hell was going on with him. Whenever I got over to his house, his parents would just smile at me, say he was busy. All the damn time. Be busy with what? I always thought they looked nervous. They said it as well. There was also a rumor floating around. Something about the cops finding him in the woods. I'm a bit fuzzy on the details. It's not like him or his parents would ever talk about it. In the summer before college started, they just moved away entirely. I don't know where to. Thought that was going to be the last time I ever saw him. Clearly, I was wrong. Out of the blue one day, he called me over to dinner. I just finished my first semester of college on a high note, so I was feeling pretty good. It was made even better by the fact that my old friend had finally reached out to me. I was excited. Excited to know what was going on with my best friend all these years. I wanted to know that things would be all right. And that everything would revert back to being normal with him, just like the old days. I wanted an explanation. But I didn't like the one that I got. It was like the plot of some bad horror movie. I don't remember what he even said verbatim. There was something about a cult. Something that both him and I had apparently encountered in the woods once. He tried so hard to convince me that it was all true, but, I wasn't having it. Eventually, I just stormed out. I don't recall anything like that ever happening. Even now, it doesn't ring a bell. But I will admit, okay, things are starting to get pretty weird. Do you believe me now? He said. About what? I responded, knowing exactly about what. The cult, he said. The followers of the masked god. I scoffed. Jesus Christ, Sean. This shit again? I understand why you thought I was crazy before, but come on. You're still denying it now after everything you've seen. So you wanted me to see that guy in our treehouse. What is he, an actor? Just like the rest of these masked assholes? Sean sighed. You think I'm the delusional one? I wanted to slam the table when he said that, but I calmed myself down. Okay, I said, sure, it's weird. Okay, all of it is. But there's got to be a better explanation than a goddamn cult. He gave me a look of disbelief. Good grief, Dave. Sounds like you're in fucking denial here. Why do you think I'm here? Where do you think I've been? I paused. That's a good question. One that I somehow hadn't bothered to ask. I don't know, I said. What are you doing here? I came back to save your ass. Like I said, this isn't something we can run away from. Let me explain, alright? Remember the last time we actually went up into that treehouse? I began opening my mouth, but quickly realized that the words weren't there. My mind was blank. I began recalling my childhood, all the time that I'd spent with Sean. It was fairly clear up until the summer before high school. I remembered what happened at the beginning, the camping trip where we both got drunk, our parents kicking our asses, watching The Dark Knight in theaters, meeting my ex-girlfriend Lindsay for the first time. But that was all in July. I couldn't remember anything past that. What the hell had happened in August? Sean grinned at my likely confused expression. It's weird, isn't it? He said. The fact that you can't remember what happened that summer. Is it though? I mean, it's not like I remember everything that ever happened to me. That's true. Maybe that summer was so insignificant that nothing worth remembering happened at all. He paused, looking me straight in the eye. But you know that's not true. Another pause. I wasn't really liking where this conversation was headed. So, what happened? I finally responded. And let me guess, it has something to do with this masked cult. He sighed, almost sounding relieved. Glad we're finally getting on the same page. What do you think? I'm not sure what to think at this point. I could see his eyes wandering over to somewhere behind me. I'll make up your mind later. Looks like they've gotten more widespread since the last time I was here. I turned around, seeing that the waitress was standing absolutely still just a few feet away, holding an empty tray, and of course, she was wearing a mask. I mean, the idea of the whole thing being a prank was becoming less and less likely. I should have moved out of this fucking town. Yeah, probably. Looks like I'm not getting my coffee either. He unzipped his jacket, revealing a pistol on his belt. Are you serious right now? I said upon seeing it. Kind of an unexpected sight. Of course I'm serious, he said. This nightmare's been going on for too long. It's time to end it. I could feel myself starting to sweat. Calling it an uncomfortable situation would have been selling it short. Please don't tell me you're planning on shooting that fucking waitress. Waitress? He chuckled. It's not a waitress. Well, whoever she is, please don't do some dumb shit. Relax, he said, zipping his jacket back up. I'm just trying to give you peace of mind. Don't you have a gun as well? Of course I don't. Do I need one? More than you know. Oh my God, I said, burying my face in my hands. There's a lot of heat in here, Sean continued. I turned back around, seeing that at least 5 more of the restaurant patrons now had masks on and were staring over at us. Fuck, this is freaky. Sean stood up and threw a crumpled $20 bill on the table. Let's get out of here. And go where? Take a guess. What? How the hell am I supposed to know? Instead of answering the question, he just walked off. We left the building and headed back onto the streets. I don't know if it's just me, but I could feel a tension rising in the air, almost like an invisible pressure in my body. It was weird. So let's say that this cult hypothetically exists, okay? What's it got to do with us? Why don't I remember any of it? I asked. Sean smiled. You should have asked that question at the beginning. I rolled my eyes. Anyway, it's a bit complicated. And I'm not sure if I remember everything myself. Let me start from where I think the beginning is. According to Sean, this is allegedly what happened. You see, we stopped using the treehouse much during the latter years of junior high. I don't know, I guess we thought that it was lame at that age. Nevertheless, we decided to go there one day, after months of not being there at all. This was in August of 2008, point where I stopped remembering anything. That day we went up there, we found a mask lying in the corner. One of those plastic theater masks. Sean said that he remembered the expression being a disturbing one, so much so that he found it hard to look at. Couldn't fathom why somebody would produce such a thing. And guess what you went and did with that mask? He asked. What? You put it on, and you tried to scare me like a fucking asshole. I could believe it. I mean, I was a bit of a rascal back then, but what he told me next was a bit less believable. As soon as I put it on, I apparently stopped moving. He thought it was part of my act at first, but I never dropped it. I just stood absolutely still, not saying a single word. Even as he tried shaking me out of my sudden trance, I wouldn't budge. Eventually, he tried to get help. But before he went on and climbed down the steps, he looked out the window and saw somebody staring up at the treehouse from the ground. A person wearing a mask standing at the edge of the clearing. Stifling an instinctive scream, he crouched down and began observing. And soon enough, this person was joined by others. And at a point, the masked people had formed an effective perimeter around the tree. This is when he started freaking out. He tried everything to get me to stir, but I wouldn't budge. And eventually he tried taking the mask off, but he couldn't. For some reason, it was stuck to my face like glue. He didn't have cell phones back then, so he couldn't just call somebody. He glanced back out the window, but couldn't see anybody there. He tilted his head and figured out why. They all moved to the base of the tree. He backed away, he grabbed the knife and baseball bat that he'd hidden in the floorboards, his only line of defense. He could hear the people beginning to climb up. He dashed over, he swung the bat at the head of the person who made it in first. To his horror, his swing didn't seem to yield any effect. He watched as the person's head violently rocked to the side upon impact. And he could hear something crack, but they didn't stop. They just kept pulling themselves up into the treehouse. In a last-ditch effort, he took out his knife and he stabbed them in the shoulder. Instead of blood seeping out of the wound, it was some kind of sand-like substance. That had no effect either. Soon enough, 3 of the masked people had made it up. Sean dropped his weapons and backed himself into a corner. They stood still for a moment before turning their heads towards me, while I was still unmoving. One of them reached out and put a hand on my head, and before chanting out some inhuman dialect, and this is when he supposedly passed out. It sounds like some kind of fucking fever dream, I interrupted him. I'm pretty sure I would have remembered something like that. Let me finish the story. Why? Does it get even more ridiculous? Let me guess. A fucking spaceship lands next, right? He sighed, sounding more frustrated than before. You're in denial. I get it. Looks like I'll have to do something drastic to bring you back to reality. Well, that doesn't sound very promising. He abruptly stopped in the middle of the street. He looked behind us and I followed his gaze. 2 police officers were standing some distance behind us. They had also stopped in their tracks, staring intently at us. Sean took out his pistol and aimed at them. Dude, please don't. He fired a shot before I could finish my sentence, striking one of the police officers straight in the chest. I put my hands up in horror. You've lost your mind, I said, starting to panic. What the hell did you just do? Look at them, he said, nearly shouting. Where's the blood? Curious. I squinted. He was right. The shot had hit the officer close to point blank, but there was no blood stain. Instead, some kind of yellow-brown substance that started leaking from the wound. Almost looked like sand. But that wasn't even the most disturbing part. The cops didn't react at all. In fact, nobody did. The streets weren't packed by any means, but there was a good dozen people in the vicinity. None of them even glanced over at us. God damn it, Sean said, looking around. Gotten worse than I thought. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I wanted to wish you a very well, we're getting close to October. Are you as excited as I am? Also, thank you for watching tonight's video, or listening to tonight's episode of the podcast, if you're listening on Spotify. We're getting further and further into the fall, and closer to those Halloween horror months, which means that if you want to find your nice Halloween horror audiobook to listen to this year, check out audible.com and look for MrCreepyPasta, because I got a whole bunch of books over there. Books like Tales from the Gas Station. Also, I want to give a very big thank you to all of my Patreons over there on Patreon, because you guys have helped me out quite a bit. Like, not even quite a bit. You guys are like, honestly, You guys pulled me out of an incredibly dark place when I first had to look at moving and all of the demon stuff that YouTube does, and thank you guys very dearly for all the help that you've given me. People like Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Brian Arce, Bobby Karman, Stephanie Butler, Tristan Pelton, Chase Burnett, Diana Kraus, Raven Mitz, Satanic Aries, Ness69420, also Aisodoehtraed, Payne, Nessie, Blitzscreed, Bardo Hawk 764, Melancholy Corpse, Ferb, Harley, Billy Morrow, Madam Skullbunny, Sashi Sazaku, at Grizzly Olsen Pro, Kayden the Spooky Boy, Zane Nightshade, MyBodySoundsLikeRiceKrispys, Ashwood, Lord of the Weebs, Jay, Faye Lockett, Miss Xander, Mr. Unsettling Spaghetti, Suji Campbell, Azarine Fox, Robert White, Fried Chicken 12, James Bruce, Freddy Krueger, Ty Nanny, Michael Scarborough, Infernal One, Lisa Cottrell, Caspian, Jordan Nels, Hades Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Cryptic Nightmares, Kiri the Sloth, Tommy Green, Liam Newman, Sky Harbor, Caleb Dougal, Nina Smith, Nico Kyle, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, Trace Miles, and Corey Kenshin. Once again, thank you all so much to everyone who is in this list of names that I mispronounce, and everyone who's in the description, and everyone who supports me at patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta. I can't thank you guys enough for listening, for watching, and I wish you all sweet dreams. Good night, everyone.